Charlemagne's story, the man who built Europe. Hello, my friends. Today I want to tell you the extraordinary story of Charlemagne, the man who, more than any other single person, shaped the continent we call Europe. His name means Charles the Great, and great he truly was, a warrior, a lawmaker, a scholar's patron, and a king who became an emperor. Yet his story is not only one of glory and conquest, it is also a story of ruthless violence, religious obsession, political genius, and a civilization rising from the ashes of a broken world. This is not just a history lesson. It is a journey into the heart of the Middle Ages, a time of darkness, fire, and extraordinary human ambition. And I promise you, by the end, you will understand not only who Charlemagne was, but why the world you live in today still carries his fingerprints. So, sit back, relax, and let us travel back more than 1,200 years to a world very different from our own, and yet, in so many ways, surprisingly familiar. Chapter 1. A World in Ruins. To understand Charlemagne, you must first understand the world into which he was born. It was the year 742, though some historians believe it may have been 747 or 748, as records from this era were poorly kept and frequently lost. The Roman Empire, which had once stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia and had given the Western world its roads, its laws, its cities, and its language, had collapsed nearly 3 centuries earlier. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor of the West had been deposed by a Germanic chieftain, and the great machinery of Roman civilization had ground to a halt. What followed was a period that historians once called the Dark Ages, though modern scholars prefer the term Early Middle Ages, recognizing that the era was more complex and creative than the old name suggests. Still, there is no denying that much had been lost. Cities had shrunk or been abandoned. Roads had crumbled. Libraries had burned. The intricate Roman system of law and administration had dissolved into a patchwork of competing kingdoms, tribal territories, and local strongmen who ruled by force rather than by principle. Western Europe in the 8th century was a fragmented, dangerous, and largely illiterate world. Latin, the language of the Church and of learning, was barely understood even by many of the priests who were supposed to use it. Trade had collapsed. Most people lived and died within a few miles of the place they were born, working land that belonged to powerful lords who offered protection in exchange for labor and loyalty. It was into this broken world that a boy named Charles was born, the son of a Frankish king named Pepin the Short, and a woman named Bertrada of Lyon, whom history remembers affectionately as Bigfoot Bertha, a nickname whose origins remain somewhat unclear. The Franks were a Germanic people who had gradually come to dominate what is now modern France, Belgium, and parts of Western Germany. They were Christians, Catholic Christians, loyal to the Pope in Rome, and they were fierce, effective warriors. Pepin the Short was a capable ruler, but it was his son Charles who would take the Frankish kingdom and transform it into something the world had never seen before. Charles would one day be called Carolus Magnus in Latin, Charles the Great. In French, he became Charlemagne. In German, Karl der Grosse, and across all of Europe, he would become a legend. Chapter 2. The young king Pepin the Short died in 768, and the Frankish kingdom was divided between his 2 sons, Charles and his younger brother Charlemagne. This was the Frankish tradition: divide the inheritance equally among male heirs. It was a tradition that caused endless conflict, because brothers who shared a kingdom rarely shared it peacefully. Charles and Charlemagne did not get along. Their relationship was cold, suspicious, and at times openly hostile. Charles was tall, physically imposing, and extraordinarily energetic. A man who could ride for hours without tiring, who ate and drank with enthusiasm, and who possessed a restless, almost inexhaustible drive. Charlemagne was quieter and more reserved. The two brothers governed their respective territories separately, and tensions between them were building toward what many observers believed would be an inevitable conflict. But then, in 771, Charlemagne died suddenly. Of natural causes, most historians believe, though the timing was certainly convenient for Charles. Charlemagne's sons were still young children, and Charles moved quickly and decisively. He claimed the entire Frankish kingdom for himself, pushing aside his nephews and their claims. Charlemagne's widow and children fled to the court of the Lombard king in Italy, where they sought protection. Charles was now sole ruler of the Franks. He was approximately 26 years old. The world had no idea what was coming. From the very beginning of his reign, Charles demonstrated qualities that would define his entire career. He was physically brave to the point of recklessness, leading his armies from the front rather than commanding safely from the rear. He was an exceptional organizer, capable of managing complex military campaigns across vast distances simultaneously. He was deeply curious, genuinely interested in learning, in theology, in languages, in the mechanical arts, at a time when most rulers could barely read their own names. And he was utterly, completely ruthless when he believed his goals required it. Chapter 3. The Warrior King. The history of Charlemagne's reign is, in large part, a history of warfare. Over the course of his reign, which lasted more than 4 decades, Charlemagne fought more than 50 military campaigns. He expanded the Frankish kingdom in virtually every direction, south into Spain, east into what is now Germany and Austria, north toward Denmark, and south again into Italy. His most important and most brutal campaign was against the Saxons. The Saxons were a collection of Germanic tribes who lived in the territories of what is now northern Germany. They were pagans. They had not converted to Christianity, and they were fiercely independent. They had resisted Frankish expansion for generations, raiding Frankish territories and retreating back into their forests whenever pursued. Charlemagne was determined to conquer them and convert them to Christianity. This was not merely a religious goal, though Charlemagne was genuinely and deeply devout. It was also a political one. In Charlemagne's world, Christianity was the great unifying force. To be Christian was to be part of a shared civilization, to accept the authority of the Church, and, by extension, to accept the authority of the Frankish king who saw himself as the Church's protector. Converting the Saxons meant not just saving their souls, in Charlemagne's view, it meant bringing them permanently under his control. The Saxon Wars lasted, on and off, for 32 years, from 772 to 804. They were extraordinarily difficult and costly. The Saxons refused to accept defeat. Again and again, Charlemagne would conquer a territory, impose baptism on the population, install Frankish administrators, and march away, only to return the following year to find the Saxons had risen again, killed the administrators, and renounced their new faith. Charlemagne's frustration eventually led him to one of the darkest acts of his reign. In 782, following a Saxon uprising in which Frankish soldiers were ambushed and killed, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day, an event known as the Massacre of Verdun. The prisoners were beheaded along the banks of the Aller River. It was an act of pure terror, designed to break Saxon resistance once and for all. It did not work immediately. The Saxons continued to resist. But eventually, After decades of grinding warfare and relentless pressure, combined with genuine missionary work by the Church, the Saxons were converted and incorporated into the Frankish realm. Their greatest leader, a man named Widukind, who had become a symbol of Saxon resistance, eventually submitted to Charlemagne and accepted baptism. Charlemagne stood as his godfather, the warrior and the convert, standing together at the baptismal font. It was a powerful image of how Charlemagne's world worked. The sword and the cross, always together. Chapter 4. The Emperor. On Christmas Day, in the year 800, in the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, something happened that would echo through the centuries. Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon the head of Charles, King of the Franks, and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans, Imperator Romanorum. The congregation in the church reportedly shouted their approval 3 times. Charles was now, in the eyes of the Church and of Western Christendom, the successor to the Roman emperors of antiquity. Charlemagne himself, according to his biographer Einhard, claimed that he had not expected the coronation and would not have entered the church that day if he had known what the Pope intended. Whether this was genuine surprise or careful political theater remains one of the great debates of medieval history. On one hand, Charlemagne had every reason to welcome the title. It elevated his status enormously and gave his rule a divine legitimacy that no Frankish king had previously possessed. On the other hand, the coronation created an immediate diplomatic crisis with the Byzantine Empire in the East, whose rulers considered themselves the true and only successors to Rome, and who regarded the Pope's action as an outrageous usurpation. Whatever Charlemagne's private feelings about the ceremony, the consequences were profound and lasting. The idea of a Christian empire in the West, an empire that saw itself as the rightful heir of Rome, guided by the Church and protected by a powerful Christian ruler, became one of the central political ideas of European civilization for the next 1,000 years. The Holy Roman Empire, which grew directly from Charlemagne's legacy, would endure in various forms until 1806, when Napoleon dissolved it. Every European monarch for centuries afterward would measure themselves against the standard Charlemagne had set. He was not merely a king. He was the model of what a Christian ruler should be. Chapter 5. The Renaissance Man of the Dark Ages. Here is something that surprises many people when they first learn it. Charlemagne, one of the greatest rulers in history, almost certainly could not write. He could read, or at least he could read Latin to some degree, and he was learning to do so better throughout his adult life. But writing, the physical act of forming letters on a page, was a skill he never properly mastered. Einhard tells us that Charlemagne kept writing tablets under his pillow at night, practicing the formation of letters in his spare moments, but that his hand, accustomed to the sword rather than the stylus, never learned to move with the necessary precision. And yet, paradoxically, Charlemagne was one of the greatest patrons of learning and education in medieval history. He understood, with a clarity remarkable for his time, that a kingdom could not be governed well by illiterate administrators, that the Church could not function properly if its priests could not read the Scriptures, and that a civilization worthy of the name required a foundation of knowledge and culture. In the late 780s and 790s, Charlemagne undertook what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a systematic effort to revive learning, literacy, and culture throughout his empire. He gathered the finest scholars in Europe to his court at Aachen, in what is now Western Germany. From England came Alcuin of York, one of the greatest scholars of the age, who became Charlemagne's chief advisor on education and theology. From Italy came Paul the Deacon, a historian and poet. From Spain and Ireland came other men of learning, drawn by Charlemagne's reputation and generosity. At Aachen, Charlemagne established what he called the Palace School, an institution that educated not only the sons of noblemen, but also, remarkably, boys of humbler origins who showed exceptional intellectual promise. Charlemagne insisted that the curriculum include not just theology and scripture, but also grammar, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, music, and astronomy, the classical subjects that the Romans had called the liberal arts. He ordered that monasteries throughout his empire establish schools and scriptoria, rooms where monks copied manuscripts by hand. It was in these scriptoria that much of the surviving literature of classical antiquity was preserved. Without the Carolingian scribes, working quietly in candlelit rooms, copying out the works of Virgil, Cicero, and countless other Roman authors, those works might have been lost forever. Charlemagne also undertook a systematic reform of the church, insisting that priests be properly educated, that church services be conducted in correct Latin, and that the liturgy, the form of worship, be standardized across his empire. He worked closely with the Pope, but was never content to be merely the church's servant. He saw himself as its co-leader, responsible for the spiritual as well as the temporal welfare of his people. This idea that a ruler's duty extended not just to the physical protection and administration of his kingdom, but to the moral and spiritual cultivation of his subjects, was one of Charlemagne's most enduring contributions to the political philosophy of Europe. Chapter 6. The Private Man. Behind the emperor, the warrior, and the scholar, there was a private man, complex, contradictory, and surprisingly human. Charlemagne was, by any standard, a man of enormous personal appetites. He married multiple times. Historians count at least 4 official wives and several concubines, and fathered at least 18 children, possibly more. He was devoted to his children in a way that was unusual for the era, insisting that his daughters be educated alongside his sons, which was highly unconventional for the time. He was reportedly so attached to his daughters that he refused to allow them to marry, preferring to keep them at court, where he could see them daily, a decision that led to considerable scandal when several of them began unofficial romantic relationships. He loved physical activity, hunting, swimming, and riding, and reportedly swam so powerfully that he could outpace most of his companions in the water. He ate and drank with great enthusiasm, but reportedly despised drunkenness in others. He had strong opinions about food. He particularly disliked the elaborate, heavily spiced dishes that were fashionable at royal courts, preferring simple roasted meats. He was intellectually curious in a way that was genuinely unusual for a man of his time and position. He loved conversation and debate. He enjoyed listening to music, though he did not play an instrument. He was learning Greek in his old age, not an easy undertaking for a native speaker of Frankish and Latin, out of pure intellectual curiosity. He was also, at times, capable of extraordinary cruelty. The massacre of Verdun was not the only dark chapter of his reign. His wars against the Avars, a nomadic people of Central Asian origin who had settled in what is now Hungary, were conducted with devastating ferocity, essentially destroying the Avar civilization entirely. His treatment of conquered peoples was frequently brutal by any standard, ancient or modern. He was not a saint. He was a man of his time, and his time was a violent one. But he was also something more than his time, which is precisely why history remembers him. Chapter 7. The Twilight of a Great Reign. By the early 9th century, Charlemagne was old and increasingly frail. The man who had once ridden for days without tiring now found long journeys painful. The appetite that had once seemed limitless was diminished. He suffered from fevers and from what Einhard describes as a pronounced limp. The question of succession, always one of the most dangerous problems for any medieval ruler, consumed much of his attention in his final years. His preferred solution was the same one that had caused such difficulty at the beginning of his own reign. He had multiple sons, and Frankish tradition called for dividing the inheritance among them. But one by one, his sons died before him. His eldest son, Pepin the Hunchback, had been disinherited years earlier after joining a rebellion against his father. Charles the Younger died in 811. Pepin of Italy died in 810. By 813, only one legitimate son remained, Louis, whom history would call Louis the Pious. In September of 813, in a solemn ceremony at Aachen, Charlemagne placed the imperial crown on Louis's head with his own hands, making him co-emperor. It was a deliberate act. By crowning his son himself, Charlemagne ensured that the legitimacy of the imperial title came from the Frankish throne, not from the Pope. It was a subtle but significant point about where power ultimately resided. On the 28th of January, 814, Charlemagne died at Aachen. He was approximately 72 years old, an extraordinary age for the era. Einhard tells us that in his final days he ate very little, drank only water, and spent his time in prayer. He received the last rites of the Church and died peacefully, which for a man of his violent and turbulent life seems almost too gentle an ending. He was buried at the Cathedral of Aachen, which he himself had built, and which remained one of the most magnificent buildings in Northern Europe for centuries. Chapter 8. The Legacy that Shaped a Continent. When Charlemagne died, he left behind the largest empire in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. But empires, as history repeatedly demonstrates, do not outlast the men who build them without great difficulty. His son, Louis the Pious, proved to be a weaker ruler than his father, and the empire was racked by civil wars during his reign. When Louis died in 840, his three surviving sons divided the empire among themselves in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, a document of enormous historical significance. The division roughly established the outlines of what would become France, Germany, and a middle territory between them that would be fought over for the next 11 centuries, all the way to the Second World War. In this sense, Charlemagne's empire did not survive him intact, but his legacy did, and it was far more durable than any political boundary. The administrative structures he created, the system of counts and royal envoys called missi dominici, who traveled the empire checking on local governors, became the foundation of medieval European governance. The educational reforms of the Carolingian Renaissance preserved classical learning and created the intellectual infrastructure from which the great universities of the 12th and 13th centuries would grow. The idea of a unified Christian civilization in the West, even after it fragmented politically, remained a powerful cultural and spiritual ideal that shaped European identity for over 1,000 years. Today, a prize called the Charlemagne Prize, the Karlspreis, is awarded annually in Aachen to individuals who have made outstanding contributions to European unity. Its recipients have included Winston Churchill, Pope John Paul II, and numerous leaders of the European Union. The prize exists because Europeans recognize, consciously or not, that the idea of Europe as a shared civilization began with a tall, restless, curious Frankish king who refused to accept that the world had to remain broken. Charlemagne is often called the father of Europe. It is not an exaggeration. Final reflection. My friends, the story of Charlemagne is one of the most complex and powerful stories in all of human history. He was a man of extraordinary contradictions. A brutal warrior who cherished learning, a man who could order thousands of executions and then sit up all night practicing his handwriting. A ruler of almost limitless ambition who genuinely believed he was serving a purpose larger than himself. He was not a good man in the simple, uncomplicated sense. He was too violent, too ruthless, too willing to use terror as a political instrument. But he was a great man. And greatness, as history reminds us again and again, is rarely comfortable. It is rarely clean. It is forged in the clash between vision and reality, between what a person believes the world should be and what it stubbornly, persistently is. What Charlemagne left behind is nothing less than the civilization of Western Europe. The languages you hear across the continent today, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, even English, all carry the fingerprints of the Latin culture he worked so hard to preserve and spread. The legal traditions, the educational institutions, the relationship between church and state, the very idea of Europe as a coherent cultural space, all of these trace a direct line back to the court at Aachen, to the restless, curious, violent, brilliant man who sat at its center. Every time you cross a border in Europe without stopping, every time a European court applies a principle of Roman law, every time a child opens a book in a school that traces its ancestry back through the medieval university system, you are living, in some small but real way, inside the legacy of Charlemagne. He built Europe, not alone and not perfectly, but he built it. Let his story inspire you. Let it remind you that civilization is not a natural state. It is a choice, made again and again, by people who decide that knowledge matters more than ignorance, that law matters more than brute force, and that the future is worth building even when the present is dark and broken. Thank you so much for listening. I hope your English has grown stronger today, and I hope this story has stayed with you. Until next time, keep learning, keep dreaming, and never stop believing in the power of a single human being to change the world.